Since it was enacted in 2017, Maryland House Bill 270, titled Testing for Lead in Drinking Water, Public and Non-Public Schools, has required schools to periodically test the water from their drinking water outlets for lead. And if any outlets show lead sample results above the action level of 5 parts per billion, one of the things schools are required to do is notify parents, teachers, and staff of those elevated results. There's 2 documents related to that. One is the notice itself, and one is a form certifying that the notice was sent out. In this video, I'm going to be discussing both, and I'm actually going to start with the certification because it contains a lot of useful information regarding the notification requirements. Right off the bat, the certification of elevated lead sample results notice tells us who to notify, parents, guardians, teachers, and staff, when to notify, within 10 school days of getting your results from the lab, and when to submit this form to MDE, within 30 calendar days of sending out the notice, with a copy of the notice attached. So let's go through the 3 sections of the certification. Section 1 is about the school. Most of this is pretty self-explanatory, except that you may not be familiar with your school's unique ID number assigned by the Maryland State Department of Education, or MSDE for short. You can find links in the video description below to help you find the school ID for your public, non-public, church-exempt, or Montessori school. Those links are also available on MDE's Lead in Schools webpage. Section 2 is titled Laboratory Information, but really the information here is about the elevated samples, when they were collected, and who analyzed them. So the certified lab name and Maryland ID number should be for the lab that analyzed the samples. Some schools also contract with the lab to collect the samples, but for this form, we don't care who collected it. We care who analyzed it. For the certification ID number, this will usually be in the format MD- and then 3 numbers, or G- and then 4 numbers. That should be somewhere on the lab report, but you can also find it on the State Certified Laboratory list available on MDE's Lead in Schools webpage. Now, Section 3 is the part of the certification that's actually about the notice. So, this first checkbox is not only asking you to confirm that it was sent out to everyone required, but also to tell us how it was sent out. So, please do make sure to fill in that box. And here's some examples of ways that you might notify the community. The second item asks you to confirm that the notice was sent out within 10 school days of getting your results. If you did not meet that 10 school day deadline, you should still write in the date you sent out the notice. If, as a result, you want to leave the box unchecked, or check the box and cross out within 10 school days, that's all fine, so long as you write in the date. The same applies to the next item. Write in the date you posted the notice to the school website, even if it was past the 30 school day deadline. If, for some reason, you never put the notice on the school website, maybe you don't have a school website, for example, make a note of that reason instead of leaving it blank. Now, this last checkbox is very useful because it lists out what needs to be in the actual body of the notice, so you can use it as a guide when you're writing your notice. Unlike the last 2 checkboxes, you can't just cross out a line for something you didn't do and keep going. All of these are required by the regulations, and if they're not included in your notice, we may ask you to send out a new one. One way to make sure everything required is included is to use MDE's notification template. The template mirrors the bullet point list. The section heads are even in roughly the same order, but your school is free to alter the language, or reorder the sections, or borrow parts for your own in-house notice, or not use the template at all, so long as all the required information from that bullet point list is still included and it's all accurate. If you do use this template, you'll notice that there's these bracketed and italicized fields, and what these indicate is the information that you need to fill in. So, let's look through them. For ease of following along, you'll also see that they're highlighted here. So, name of school is pretty self-explanatory, but here, for the date and number of samples collected, this is generally referring to the 3-year routine sampling event. Once you've notified the school community that a certain outlet has an elevated result, and you've already closed or prevented access to that outlet, you don't have to keep sending out notification every time you do a follow-up test and the result is still elevated, so long as you closed or prevented access to that outlet when you sent out the notice and it stayed closed since then. On that note, let's take a second to reiterate what an elevated testing result even is, because the next bracket asks you to count how many elevated samples you had. So let's say you have a faucet with a result of 5.3 parts per billion. That's abbreviated as ppb. Would you count that as an elevated test result? No. A test result is elevated if it exceeds the action level, and the action level is set by law to 5, not 5.0.
Any results greater than or equal to 5.5 parts per billion would be considered elevated. This is because 5.5 rounds up to the nearest integer of 6, which exceeds the action level of 5 parts per billion.
Any decimal value below 5.5 rounds down to 5. So it's actually considered equal to the action level, not exceeding it. So that outlet with a result of 5.3 wouldn't be counted as elevated, and the regulations wouldn't require that you include it in the notice or remediate it, although you're free to do so voluntarily.
On the other hand, if your results are exactly 5.5 parts per billion, that rounds up to 6 parts per billion, so your results are elevated. To summarize, any result greater than or equal to 5.5 parts per billion is considered elevated. By the way, if your results are something like 0.004, check your units. Your results might not be in parts per billion, and you'll need to convert them. For more information on what's considered an elevated lead result, and on interpreting your lab results which could potentially be in different units than parts per billion, see MDE's video linked in the description below.
So here, when listing the elevated lead sample results, use the exact numerical values from your lab report. You do need to include outlets even if they're non-consumption outlets, but you might want to clarify which of the outlets those non-consumption outlets are. Now, for the outlet location, you want to make sure the description is specific and clear for the parents, teachers, and staff that you're giving the notice to. For example, teacher sink in Dr. Skellebone's anatomy classroom is probably much clearer for parents, teachers, and staff than outlet 357S, even though 357S is the outlet ID that's on the floor plan and that we ask you to use when you're submitting documentation about the outlet. If you can also fit that outlet ID in, that's great, it makes it much easier for MDE staff, but don't use that as the location description. So the next sections to update are the immediate actions and next steps sections. For immediate actions, remember how you're supposed to block access to the elevated outlets within 24 hours of getting your lab results? So here's where you tell people what you actually did. You turned off the valve, you taped over the outlet, or maybe you just put up a non-consumption sign if it's an appropriate outlet to do that. If you were able to collect follow-up flush samples by the time you sent out the notice, this would also be a good place to tell people that. For next steps, this is just what you're planning to do to remediate the outlet.
If every elevated outlet has already been remediated or has non-consumption signage permanently posted, then you might just be writing that there are no next steps. But don't leave it blank.
If your non-consumption signage, by the way, is temporary while you plan your remediation, you do still need to fill out the section. Now the only thing left to add is the contact information, and that's it for the template.
Once again, you are free to alter this template or make your own version entirely, so long as you do not omit any of the required information listed in the certification form, and it's all accurate.
And speaking of the certification, the only thing left is the contact information and signature fields.
When you submit these documents, make sure to submit both of them to testresults.leadschoolwater@maryland.gov, and that's it for the notification documents.
Thank you for viewing this video explanation of the Elevated Lead Sample Results Notice template and certification of Elevated Lead Sample Results Notice. If you have any questions about this or any other forms related to standard and routine sampling, our contact information and a link to the Lead in Schools testing webpage are listed in the video description below. Thank you.